All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Watchmen. This is a joint effort between myself, Paul Lear, or Paul the Poke, as some people would know me, and also with Czekmate from valortube.com. At this point, I'd like to say hello to Czekmate. How's it going today?
Hey, it's going really well, Paul the Poke. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing okay. I know we'd been talking about getting together and having a discussion. Been a lot of attention, a lot of oxygen being sucked out of the room with the issues going on between Russia and Ukraine. And one of the things we wanted to discuss was quietly, there are lots of things going on in regards to the country of Iran. Do you have any kind of introductory comments you would like to tell us about at this time?
I think I would start with something extremely general, and that is to say that nothing in international affairs, because international affairs is simply international politics, nothing occurs in isolation. And one has to look at the relationship between Russia and Iran has gotten exceptionally cozy, as it has between China and Iran. Is that there's a theory in international politics called encirclement, where all of the smaller players team up to keep the bigger player in check. We're the bigger player. And that is where the world is right now, is that people are identifying common interest, and the resolve of certain allies based on the US geopolitical outlook is weakened right now, so they're more susceptible to doing deals as a means to hedge their bets. And that's the world we live in. So while Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing in Moscow, we've got the Iranians. They're moving around the board and they're doing it really pretty quietly, which is abnormal for them. And I guess we'll be getting into that here.
Absolutely. And why we care about the the cooperation, if you will, between the Russians and Iran has to do with the prophecy in Ezekiel's chapters 38 and 39. Word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog. Now, pretty obvious at this point that Magog is what is modern day Russia. Got plenty of studies up at paulthepoke.com in regards to that. But also of interest is down here in verse 5 where it talks about Persia. Well, historically, Persia has been Persia until roughly the 20th century, at which point a lot of a lot of times that just became synonymous with Iran. So that's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Uh, and Russia will be joined by Meshech, Tubal, Beth Dagarma, Gomer. That'd be modern day Turkey and Persia or modern day Iran. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And at the core of it is down here in verse 13 and 14. To take away livestock, goods to steal, seize great spoil, um, and take things. And the big prize in all of this is natural gas, oil, resources. Also, modern day Iran is known biblically as ancient Elam. Give you a quick lay of the land. We'll go down and here take a look at Iran. That would be this southwest region, and right at the heart of what is ancient biblical Iran is essentially a town called Bushehr, which is a major nuclear facility, is located in and around this area of Iran. So it's fascinating that you have these ancient names for Iran, and the heart of these ancient names are very sensitive assets in today's world. And so, and speaking of the natural gas piece of this, we're going to move a little bit further north of Tehran, up here into the Caspian Sea. And this was something that Czekmate had brought to my attention, and this was back in November of 2021. And this is from oilprice.com, Russia's biggest move yet to take control of the European gas market. And this is where I'm sure you have plenty to say about this, Czekmate, and your thoughts on this as far as Russia and Iran getting together in regards to natural gas in the European market.
That's right. What belies the tension that's going on between Ukraine and Russia really comes down to two things: food and natural gas. with a very close third place being access to the sea for Russia in the port of Sevastopol. I put that in third place just because the Russians have Sevastopol and the entire Crimean Peninsula, and they're not giving it up. So I really don't see it as being in play unless the Russians take a horrendous military bruising and they can get kicked out of there. So I kind of leave that one off the table, but it really does come down to east-west energy flow between Eurasia and Europe. Europe, of course, having a voracious industrial appetite for things such as natural gas. So anything that would come out of the Caspian, it wouldn't make any sense to ship it over land to the Persian Gulf if you can just move it directly west, either across the land bridge between the Black Sea and the Caspian, or you can use existing infrastructure that Russia already has set up and by ship just move it from northern Iran across the Caspian and put it in the pipeline. Well, it appears that the Russians and the Iranians have come to a deal where, for all intents and purposes, Gazprom is going to do the heavy lifting on behalf of the Iranians, and the Iranians will get their cut, but it's a pretty small cut compared to what is in the ground. And the reason for this is that there's been a lot of brain drain in Iran. They don't have the engineers, they don't have the expertise. They have a workforce only in the sense that there's plenty of available labor on the Iranian economy right now, but it's not skilled labor that you would find in your average industry workman. It's a fungible commodity, and I think a lot of those workers have found work in other parts of the Persian Gulf. So what it comes down to is that the Russians have brokered a very favorable natural gas extraction agreement with the Iranians. I would argue that they probably walked away when they toasted vodka. They refer to the Persians as suckers, because in another place where they're exploring for natural gas, being Syria, they brokered another similar agreement where the central government gets its cut, but it's subsidiaries of Gazprom that are getting the money out of it. So in all of this, the big target is controlling energy that goes into Europe, and in Moscow, the strategic view of that is being able to coerce Western Europe. In the absence of robust flows coming out of the United States and North America, that leaves Russia the prime player. The only thing that would hinder their players from closing that deal right now is the state of Israel and the Tamar and Leviathan gas fields offshore.
And those are located, for those of you not familiar, that's down here in the Eastern Mediterranean. We'll zoom in on that. That's off the coast of Israel in this location. And it's a big deal. I was reading an article earlier today that effectively all the natural gas that Russia had shipped to underground storage in Europe, they are out of gas, natural gas in Europe. And here we are, late February. We still got parts of March before things start to warm up. So it could get a little chilly in Western Europe for the remainder of winter. They're in a tight spot. They need resources, and they're not really going to probably, NATO's not going to do a whole lot because they need gas. And Ukraine is, they're on their own, and not a good situation to be in. We talk a lot about Iran and just everything Iran's doing. I mean, so we have those pieces of the puzzle as described. And then also one of the things we've talked about between the two of us is the Iranian proxies, where they have their fingers all over the place in the Middle East. And this is from Elent News, and this is a map of Iran's regional proxy forces in the Middle East, and it's controlled by the Quds force. The Quds is the Iranian word, or the Farsi, I think it's Farsi, word for Jerusalem. They call Jerusalem Quds. And here are all the networks, Iranian proxy forces across the Middle East, and this is right up your alley, Czekmate. I know you have some things to say about this as well.
Certainly. If you there's sort of an adage in the Middle East, because when you look at the Eastern Persian Gulf, where the Sunni Arab governments get their energy revenue from, there are tribes of Shiites in those areas, and so Arabs tend to wryly joke that wherever God put wherever God put oil, he put Shiites on top of it. So you see in places like Bahrain, there's a restive Shiite population, agitates against the monarchy. The Saudis help keep that under control. In Yemen, there's not much in the way of resources there. However, it sits right next to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which goes between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And it's always understood that if you can't get at the oil, you get at the choke points for it, be they pipelines or be they maritime trade routes, such as what you're highlighting right now. And then across the strait from there in Djibouti, there's not much of an Iranian footprint, but there is a Chinese naval base, not far from where a U.S. Special Operations base happens to be. It's really not a Chinese naval base. It masquerades as a as a commercial sponsored port, but wherever the Chinese flag goes, their military goes as well. And so that's something to keep in mind. And of course, there are the interests that are in Iraq, in Syria. The Iranian influence in Iraq is turned into a very mixed picture. There was a once known figure in Iraqi politics who people blame for getting us into the Iraq War, Ahmed Chalabi, who it looks like one of his theories is actually standing up, is that the Shiites in Iraq would turn into such a headache for the Iranians that managing them would be a full-time job. And the Iranians, for the time being, looks like they don't have a fully consolidated hold over the Iraqi Shiites. That appears to have shifted, and this goes up towards north of Israel. This appears to have shifted to Hezbollah. It now looks like Hezbollah calls more of the shots among the Shiites in the rest of the Middle East than the Iranian central government does. My thinking behind that is that the sanctions have really worked and that Hezbollah became the most viable place to keep the payments going to all of these groups. Because if these groups don't get paid, they don't do the work for the Iranians. That's all there is to it. This is an organized crime syndicate with a terror problem. It is not a terror group with a drug problem. It's the other way. And so the money has been now going through Lebanon, and as we'll, I guess, see in subsequent discussion, Lebanon, southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah and the Shiites of Lebanon are, factor in a great deal with respect to the Israeli security picture and their decision whether or not to hit Iran or not.
So one thing that is probably confusing to a lot of folks, and it's something I didn't have a good grasp on initially, is this whole Sunni versus Shia argument. And, primarily as a goal, Iran would like to have a Shia corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean, so they don't, just run all their resources, oil and gas resources, via pipeline through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, etc., to ports, to where then they could ship it to the west, instead of have to take that all the way around the Arabian Peninsula and go back up through the Suez Canal. Explain a little bit how Sunni v. Shia gets reconciled with these folks, because they're Muslims. Not to listen to them, they both think the others are heretics. But how does that get reconciled in all of this?
Well, to go into the history of it, I don't recall it that clearly, because at a certain point in my career, when I was serving in the Middle East, I realized its importance is only occasional in what I was doing on any given day. The history of the division between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Sunnis is a derivative word of Sunnah, which means the brotherhood. And what that basically amounts to, it goes to succession. Who was the rightful heir in the succession of leadership of the entire faith after Muhammad had died. So who was the rightful heir to the caliphate? What Shiism has really become, more than anything as a religion, it's really more of a Persian imperialist philosophy at this point. And there are several subsects of the Sunni religion within Islam, and that's what spans most of the globe, is the Sunni religion. But they get into these internecine fights. It remains to this day. The revolution in Iran in 1979 that vaulted the Ayatollah to power really threw jet fuel on it. And this division has actually served well for the cause of a transient peace, the Abraham Accords, is that The Sunnis are looking at the Shiites on the cusp of developing a bomb, and that is where this divide gets aggravated once more, is that a Shiite imperialist government in Tehran with nuclear weapons really scares the rest of the Middle East. And that's why you see a lot of cooperation with Israel right now between Sunni nations and Israel.
Excellent analysis there. So as we see all of these things happening within the Middle East and Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, we still have these alleged talks that are taking place in Vienna. And where do you see that standing right now? And just give me your general impressions of the things that are taking place in Vienna.
Well, I guess this does bring the discussion full circle, doesn't it? That when we began, I said none of these things occur in isolation. I bluntly believe that the Russian aspiration to corner the energy market that feeds Western Europe, the only outstanding issue are the Israeli natural gas fields, and it is the only thing that could threaten the standing of Vladimir Putin with respect to natural gas, with U.S. gas offline. We come back into the picture and our infrastructure, it would take some time now with what the Biden administration has done. We could undermine that entire effort that Putin has, but it would take some time for that effect to be had. In the meantime, the Israelis are really the only thing that threatens the Russian energy play right now. So with that in mind, when you look at the standoff between the Russians and the Ukrainians, if you look at the fact that the discussions between Iran and the Permanent Five of the Security Council, plus the European Union, with the Russians as the presidency of the United Nations Security Council, there's been a great deal of progress on returning to the 2015 Obama-inspired JCPOA. That's the Joint Cooperation Initiative for peaceful nuclear use of the Iranians. And really get that out of your head. It was a gigantic kickback scheme. That's all it was. The Iranians got a huge infusion of cash, and parts of that money went to other parts of the globe, and it was facilitation money and hush money. It was a chance to raid the bank. That's really all there was to it. So with the JCPOA about to be somewhat renewed, it's really more the sanctions the Iranians want relieved. They've gotten some of those notionally. If they go ahead and they sign something, there is plenty that the executive branch can do unilaterally to take the pressure off the Iranians. And when you look at the east-west flows and the natural gas issue that we had discussed in the Caspian Sea, and you look at the transit corridor that Ukraine is for natural gas, this is where the whole natural gas issue is really central to what is happening between Ukraine and Russia and Iran and Russia and Israel. It all comes back to these east-west energy flows. And right now, the biggest thing that's in the way is Israel. And the surest way to marginalize Israel is to stir up consternation between Tehran and Israel over the nuclear issue.
And that stuff is in the press all the time. And I guess the thing that, those comments bring home to me is when, we go back to Ezekiel 38 verses 13. Have you come to see spoil? Have you assembled your hosts? And that's talking about Russia and friends. And the latest I saw, Russia has anywhere from, it's estimated from 150 to 190,000 troops near the Ukrainian border. Some estimate that's up to 75% of their armed forces. And eventually, it's not any more complicated in the sense as to seize great spoil. And that great spoil, oil and natural gas resources, and specifically the Israeli natural gas resources down here on the eastern Mediterranean. And they have some of the greatest gas reserves on the planet. They would be a viable competitor to Russia, or who is ancient Magog. And that's what's driving this. And Putin has stated he wants to control, as Czekmate's made very clear, control the full flow of resources from east to west into Europe. And also like to encourage people to check out, I keep saying that's a lame pun, Czekmate, the Fighting Czekmates at valortube.com. This is his homepage, and he puts out, gosh, 10 to 15 posts a day regarding happenings going on in the Middle East and in Europe, and would highly recommend everybody taking the time to stop and see that. Some good stuff there. And in closing, are there any other comments that you'd have to wrap this up?
What I would say is that Vladimir Putin, with respect to the natural gas and the east-west flows, Vladimir Putin and his coterie appear to be operating under the assumption that this is a matter of national survival for Russia. That they really don't, in the face of a great demographic slide, if you look at that area that is the land bridge between the Caucasus and the Black Sea, that region is going Muslim rapidly. And your Christian, Slavic, white Russian is a dying breed. Likewise, over on the Russia-Chinese border, there's an Anschluss taking place from China into Siberia, where a lot of these natural gas mining concerns and timber logging camps are now really being taken over by cheaper Chinese workers. Russia really sees the whole natural gas and east-west energy flow as being what they need to stave off the extinction of Russia as we currently know it. And it is in the face of that survival imperative that Putin very well, while his army is in a position right there at Crimea and along the Sea of Azov, just north of the Black Sea, while the troops are there and while the naval assets are there, making a slide down into the Mediterranean. If you follow Fighting Checkmates, you will have seen that a lot of naval assets in Russia have been concentrated in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. It is not unrealistic to think that a Russian attempt to fortify their positions in Syria with a real eye on Israel could very well happen. And we'll have to wait and see how much more they assert themselves within Syrian affairs, which they've been doing a great deal of lately. I think that after the Ukraine issue is over, I think I had said this back in November on Fighting Checkmates, and my timing was off, but it could very well be that what you're going to see is that maybe this thing ends in Ukraine without firing a shot. Maybe there's some limited fighting. I doubt there's going to be a full-on invasion. But afterward, I think you see some of those reinforcements go down to Tartus and Latakia, never to return. That they're just going there.
And some of that was happening in Belarus. I'd seen some articles where they were just talking about moving resources into Belarus on a temporary basis. They're not going to be there permanently. And I completely agree with your assessment of that, because they've got the two seaports, one in Latakia, one in Tartus, and they are moving naval and air resources in there on a daily basis, and not be surprised. And we also know Scripture tells us, and I believe that's in Ezekiel 39, that there will be massive amounts of resources that are going to be moved in and around Israel, to the point those that dwell in the cities of Israel go out and make fires and weapons and burn them, shields and bucklers, bow and arrows, clubs and spears. They will make fires of them for 7 years. So there's going to be a lot of resources at some point in the future that will get dumped into the Middle East by Russia and friends. So all of this stuff that we're talking about is very plausible and doesn't seem that much of a stretch in what we're observing in today's world. Now, does that mean it's going to happen imminently? We don't know the answer to that, but these are things that do make sense in light of what Ezekiel had written 2,700 years ago, and we need to pay attention to it. And, I appreciate you guys taking the time to stop and listen to another edition of The Watchmen. To borrow a phrase, just a couple of dudes sitting on the wall checking it out, seeing what's going on. You have any closing comments?
If you all have problems getting on ValorTube, it is a work in progress. Leave word with us, and we'll pester the management to see to it. In the meantime, I'm going to make what I post on the Fighting Checkmates by way of summations or really big headlining articles. I'll do my best to draw Paul the Poke's attention to them and make sure that he passes them on. But please do check out ValorTube, and if you have difficulty, leave word with Paul the Poke. Sorry about that, Paul.
That's all right.
And we'll pester the management to fix the issues that are at hand.
All right, and likewise, I've done some summaries of some of Checkmate's comments, and I've posted those available at the website paulthepoke.com. Some of this information has also been placed at Trey Smith's God in a Nutshell Facebook page. You can get some of that information there if you're not finding it there. I'm also available on Twitter, Paul the Poke, and oh gosh, got some stuff at Telegram. I've got multiple sites, but if you just type it in on Google, you'll be able to find it one way or another. So appreciate you guys taking the time to stop by. I'm sure we'll be talking again. Appreciate you guys listening. Take care and have a good one. Bye.
Bless.